Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this evening's live stream. We've got quite a busy lineup for you tonight, but I'll start with a couple of news things. First of all, what's been in the news this week? Obviously, the Scottish Parliament has started looking at MSPs who started talking about introducing a bill about assisted suicide. This is the way it goes, isn't it? All the way through the election campaign, no one's talking about it, no mention at all. As soon as the election's over with, then out it comes, and it's been pushed forward at quite a rate. So that's going to be an issue that's going to get a lot of attention from us over the coming months. We're obviously very much opposed to assisted suicide, so we'll see how that turns out. And the other big news this week has been the release of the OECD report into Scottish education. Now, that's been something that's been much heralded, has been spoken about in the media a lot, but I've had a look at it. I've actually made a video about it today, so that video will be released over the well, maybe in a couple of days' time. Just to give you a quick spoiler, I suppose basically the picture is that the OECD isn't some neutral organization that comes and judges your education by some sort of objective standard. It's basically biased and skewed in the direction that Scottish education is already. So we need to look at what they say in the light of that. So I've got a video about that coming out in a couple of days. Now, I'm just noticing here, we've actually got a problem with the broadcast on Facebook. It doesn't seem to be working on Facebook, so I'll just try that again. Let's see if that's working. Right, hopefully that's connecting to Facebook now. Right, let me tell you what we've got this evening. First of all, I'm going to speak to Philip Tanzer. He's got something to share with us. He's been doing a spot of research. So we'll hear what he's got to say for the first, 10 minutes or quarter of an hour or so. Then after then, I'm going to hand over to Michael Willis, our chairman, who's going to speak to Stuart Geddes about Stuart's experience as a local councillor a few years ago. The reason we're doing that is just so we can learn a bit about what's involved with that in order to prepare us for our election campaign, because we're going to have candidates in the local elections next year as well. So that's what we'll be doing in the second part of the program. Right, we're still having a spot of trouble with Facebook, but it's just trying again. Right, we'll let that try again in the background. But in the meantime, welcome to Phil. Okay, welcome to Phil in Durness. Thanks for joining us again.
Good evening. Hi, Richard. It was very, very nice seeing you on the weekend on Saturday in Edinburgh when we did the March for Men, where we highlighted certain issues that predominantly affect men and boys. Thank you so much for being with us on that day and for speaking at the march.
No, I enjoyed it. In fact, you want to just say a little bit about that? The response from the people, public on the march seemed very positive, isn't it? A lot of people saying, "Oh yeah, that's a good point. We're glad that you're making that point." You're pleased with that
very
response?
good, very, very positive response. And to be honest, that's the response that you usually get in the public. And I think that's in line with certain research that has been done or surveys that the wider majority of people, the wider public, is actually quite open and quite aware of certain issues and would like to listen to these issues. But unfortunately, the media and current politicians do ignore these issues. And there is not a loud lobby group that is constantly screaming about it. So it can be ignored.
Yeah. Right, okay, well, this slot, as I've explained in the live stream, we're going to have this slot where someone comes on and shares something that they've researched or something that they'd like to talk about, something very specific. So, Phil, what have you got for us this evening?
This is actually in line with gender-based discrimination against men and boys, and I would like to talk about discrimination against men in the NHS best practice and guidelines. And I found this on the website Health Scotland. And maybe if you could, you can put it up on screen. Yeah, thank you very much. And I would like to just read this out. It's about gender-based violence, the gender-based violence overview. Overview of routine inquiries. Routine inquiries involves asking all women at assessment about abuse regardless of whether there are any indicators or suspicions of abuse. So to make this clear, every single woman that enters the NHS for any reason will be asked if she experienced domestic abuse. Now, it's very obvious that only women were mentioned here. How about men? And we need to scroll down to the section of selective inquiry. And I'm going to read that out as well. Selective inquiry involves acting on suspicion or concerns that someone is experiencing abuse, for example, through observation of physical or behavioral indicators, rather than asking everyone as a matter of standard practice. Survivors of gender-based violence can present in any setting in the NHS, and it is important that all staff are aware of potential signs of abuse and are able to respond appropriately. Equally, it is crucial that this applies to both male and female service users. The absence of routine inquiries does not mean that concerns about abuse should be ignored. Some men are abused by their female or male partners, and it is important that their needs are recognized, taken seriously, and addressed sensitively. Frontline staff should be aware of the indicators of abuse, and if they have concerns, staff should ask relevant questions to aid disclosure and identify support needs. Selective inquiry of domestic abuse is more appropriate to men as, and now here's a bullet point list, the prevalence for men is not as significant as that for women. Men do not experience similar levels of injuries. The dynamics of abuse for men and women are different. Women are more likely to be fearful of their partners and to experience sustained abuse, resulting in considerable implications, in particular for mental health and substance misuse. Women are more likely to experience sexual violence and degradation. There is a lack of evidence about the acceptability to men of being asked about abuse, and there is a lack of evidence about effective interventions for men. So, after reading that, I would like to put certain things into context. 35% of victims of domestic abuse are men, according to ONS statistics. And it's also, according to ONS statistics, men are 3 times less likely to report the abuse they experience. In other words, men are already far less likely to talk about the abuse that they experience. And I think that is very much in line with what we would assume. Men usually don't talk about having problems. And the interesting thing is when we look at the list of reasons why men shouldn't be asked about abuse as standard practice, when they say the prevalence for men is not as significant as that for women. Now, the thing is, very, very few men actually reported to the NHS because they are far less likely to talk about it. So there should actually be more of a standard practice to specifically ask men because they are less likely to talk about it. Instead, it's being swept under the rug. The next point that they mention is men do not experience similar levels of injuries. That is actually true, but men experience higher levels of emotional abuse by their female partners. And we all know that men are far more likely to commit suicide, and men are also far less likely to talk about mental health issues. So currently, 3/4 of people that commit suicide are men currently. The next point that they mention is the dynamics of abuse for men and women are different. Women are more likely to be fearful of their partners and to experience sustained abuse, resulting in considerable implications, in particular for mental health and substance misuse. Now, especially the last point, substance misuse. We all know that men are more likely to actually experience substance misuse, and nobody ever looks into how many of these cases actually experience domestic abuse or emotional abuse in relationships. The thing is, all the research done in these areas is only targeted towards women, and that is the big issue. You can't talk about male victims if you never look at male victims. The other point, that women are more fearful. A friend of mine, Deborah Powney, who is a researcher, and she created the biggest research into male victims of domestic abuse and coercive control, actually found that the levels of fear amongst male victims are the same as in women, and in men, levels of fear are especially high in regards to losing their children and protecting their children, and not being able to leave the abusive partner because they are afraid to leave the children behind. The next point was there is lack of evidence about the acceptability to men of being asked about abuse. Now, this is obviously absolutely ridiculous. If there is lack of evidence, then do research. It's very clear that they never asked men, that they never really did research. And I do agree that men and women need slightly different approaches, but then you just have to find an approach that works better for men. And the last point that they mentioned was there is lack of evidence about effective interventions for men. Well, there is no government funding for interventions for men, and because all these best practices are influenced by Women's Aid and women's organization and by politicians that prefer a highly gendered narrative in regards to domestic abuse. And obviously on top, that is Nicola Sturgeon. They all push towards more help for women, no support for men. So that's why there is no research, that there is no proof for effectiveness of interventions, because nobody actually tried it. So that's what I wanted to talk about. Do you have any question, or does the audience have any questions?
Hey, if you've got any questions, do type them in. But our question would be, what would you prefer? Would you prefer that men were asked, or do you think it just shouldn't be a routine question in the NHS?
That's a very good question. I think that by asking routine questions, and especially if these questions are leading, you might actually blow things out of proportion. And that happened to friends of mine, where their completely normal relationship was pathologized in some ways, and their family was destroyed, even though nothing really had happened. On the other hand, I do think there are instances where victims don't realize that they actually experience long-term, especially emotional abuse. So I'm not against asking general questions, but I don't think these questions should be asked by the staff. I think these should be more paperwork, where you can just write something down and then it can be addressed afterwards. I think that would be much better for men, because men will not give straight answers if they are being asked by staff, because it's embarrassing for most men. And in the guidelines of Health Scotland, it says, oh, if you see injuries in men, or if there is something indicating that the man experiences abuse, men are very good covering that up, and a lot of women are also good covering that up. And I think what really needs to happen is that when they create guidelines like that, they have to talk to service providers for both men and women and say, what's the best approach? How can we sort out which cases are real abuse and which cases are just, let's say, normal relationships and normal issues, without wanting to downplay something.
Yeah, I would say my take would be, I think the problem with asking every woman, every time she goes to hospital or some sort of medical procedure, I think it's just pushing the issue to the forefront of people's minds in a way that's disproportionate. It sounds to me like If you have an organization whose mission and funding is to push for action in this area, then they've got to think of more and more things to do, and they've thought of doing this. But surely, I mean, there could be all sorts of other questions people could be routinely asked about various aspects of the health that might give an indication of some serious illness or whatever. So I just feel it's disproportionate. And I think the effect of pushing something so negative to the forefront of people's minds so routinely, I think that can have a negative effect as well. It's not something that should be given that sort of prominence, I would suggest.
I would completely agree. Now, the question is, why is it pushed to the forefront, especially for women? Well, because there's a very strong lobby group from Women's Aid, and they get more money if there are more victims. And I definitely do not want to attack the frontline workers in Women's Aid that I'm sure are doing great work. But I think higher up, where it's just about money and funding, I think there is a high incentive to blow the numbers out of proportion.
Yeah. So just carrying on, making it up as I go along a little bit. I suppose my thinking now is, if you imagine someone saying to a woman who goes in with, she hit her thumb with a hammer or something, and they say, basically, does your husband abuse you, experiencing domestic abuse? The message is basically, we think the risk from men is so high. In other words, men are so bad that this is so widespread that it's worth just routinely checking. Yeah, and I think it's the wrong message to be giving.
I completely agree. The question itself indicates all women are seen as victims and vulnerable and helpless, and that indicates all men are seen as perpetrators and dominating in relationships. That's the message that you get out of this questioning.
Yeah. Well,
and to be honest, I think I think that this best practice actually opens a path to a legal challenge. Unfortunately, I'm already doing a legal challenge in another area, but if anybody watching wants to sue the NHS in that regard, that would be lovely.
Well, that was fascinating. I didn't know anything about that issue, so that's what this little slot's about in the live stream. So thanks very much, Phil, and we'll see you soon. Right, good night.
Thank you very much for having me, and enjoy the rest of the show.
Right, goodbye. Right, the rest of the show. So on to our next two guests. This is more the way the live stream is going to be from now on. There's going to be more people popping up on screen. So welcome to our chairman. Hello, Michael.
Hello, Richard. Good evening.
So we've got Michael in Stirling, and joining Michael, we have Stuart Geddes. So at this point, I will bow out, and Michael can welcome Stuart, and I will be a keen listener. So over to Michael and Stuart. Welcome, Stuart.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that handover, Richard. And I very much enjoyed that slot with Philip, but I'm very pleased to welcome Stuart Geddes. We've chatted a couple of times. I know he's a keen walker, and he's not so keen on cyclists, but I'm sure we'll come to that. And as you know, the Scottish Family Party is a political party, and after getting our political machine has been very well oiled, and we're looking to. I've got a slight bit of feedback here on one of the mics. So we're very keen on maintaining the party machine, and we see a great opportunity in the 2022 local authority elections. And I know Stephen has experience as a councillor, and he's got a lot of very, very good ideas about how to fight local issues. So by way of introduction, Stuart, could you give us an introduction to your background?
Yes, thank you, Michael. I'm in Edinburgh. I live in Edinburgh nowadays, but I'm originally from the other place. But my passport having been stamped, I had to go south before I came north. I worked for 33 years in commercial banking at a time when commercial banking was still a profession. And in early 2000s, I got involved in politics. Or rather, I was always interested in politics, but my wife gave me permission to get involved in politics. And I would say this to anyone that's listening: if you want to get involved, be prepared for hard work and a lot of hassle. But if your family are not 100% behind you and kind of standing with you, don't go there. One of the saddest things that happened to me when I was a councillor was talking to this colleague, a councillor, elderly gentleman, who said that he had stood for council and was up for re-election. His wife said, "If you stand again, I will leave you." He stood again, and she left him. And yeah, it was tragic, really. And I haven't really been involved in frontline politics a little while, partly for that reason. But I spent a number of years down in Essex. I lived in a place called Billericay, which everyone's heard of, but no one knows where it is. But if you take a line at 2:30 out of Trafalgar Square, you'll come through Billericay. It's part of Basildon District now. And in 2003, I was elected to Basildon District Council as a member for the Pitsea Southwest Ward, which, you know, I stood in one as a Conservative. Pitsea Southwest was not what you would call Conservative territory. Yet the people there had been so ignored by the Labour Party that they actually realised that the only people who were interested in them were the Conservatives, and I was elected. When I won my seat on the council, my seat gave the Conservative Party a majority on the council for the first time in donkey's ages. Basildon had been known as Moscow on the Thames. And the MP for the area was a lady called Angela Smith, and she was private PPC for a certain Gordon Brown. So you can imagine how that went down in Westminster when the Conservatives took control of that council. And to be honest, when I was elected, I discovered that I was going to be paid a salary. I didn't even know that I was going to get that when the meetings took place of an evening. So I would be working in the West End of London during the day. I would come home, and this is where my wife's support came in so crucially, that I would walk in the door to my home. I was handed a plate of food, and half an hour later I was back out the door, and not getting home till 10:30 at night. And that would happen 2-3 nights a week. So it was a bit of a challenge, but it was an exciting time as well. Basildon District, for the next 4 years, the Labour Party in government saw to it that we got the absolute minimum of grant. The government changed the law retrospectively to prevent us from enforcing planning, and with regards to travellers. What else was there? Yeah, and we were the very first council in England and Wales to appoint a non-white individual to be our chief executive. He was also appointed for the first time on a performance contract. Basically, if you deliver, we'll give you a bonus. If you don't, we'll sack you. Do you understand that? and he went through that council like a dose of salts, and delivered a tremendous thing.
Stuart, could I take you back then to getting elected for the first time? So you had all these years in banking, but in terms of the skill set you need to undertake that task, what are the main what's the main sort of criteria? I mean, how do you do that job well as a councillor?
I think first and foremost, you have to be, at a very least, a very curious individual. You have to be curious to the point of being cynical. And anything that is put in front of you, paperwork or anything that is told to you, you have to assume it's a lie until you've proven it's otherwise. So that if you go into a council role with that attitude, now clearly you have to work with the officers, and you have to be polite and courteous with them, and to treat them with proper respect, and and be polite, and but never believe a word they tell you until you've checked it. Always do your homework, read up, and always and you almost have to kind of ask yourself 3 questions about anything that's put in front of you. What is it? So what? Then what? So I would say your prime qualification is attention to detail, a cynical level of questioning, and a burning desire to do things right.
So it strikes me it's very similar to the role of a non-executive director in the private sector. They're not actually doing the work. They're sort of scrutinizing, they're checking up on, they're not taking everything at face value, and they're holding the executive officers to account.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
I think the other thing you have to remember as an elected official is that you have very little power. Believe it or not, the council employs one individual, and that is the chief executive of the council. The chief executive of the council employs the 20,000 people that are the bane of your life, and you can't touch them, and they know it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I was interested in what you had to say about getting, the full support of your family and your wife, because it could lead to divorce, as in the example that you gave us. And I know a lot of our candidates that are starting to come forward, the strong ones have 100% support from their families, and it's just not doable unless you have that in the background. So
Yeah.
that's an excellent piece of advice. So you get appointed, you're on the council, and are you saying then you could tie down a full-time job in the city, go back up to Billericay, and then that most of the work takes place in the council meetings in the evening and the subcommittees, so you can work in parallel with a full-time job?
I did, but I would put a caveat on that, saying that in somewhere like Edinburgh, the City of Edinburgh Council, I believe that most of the meetings actually take place during the day, and so it might be a bit more tricky to hold down a full-time job. Certainly, City of Edinburgh Council councillors are paid a lot more than I was paid. I think the last I heard, they were getting about 22 grand a year, and I'm not quite sure that I think that's appropriate, but that's what's being paid. But it does mean that someone who's on a modest salary, it's almost enough to live on, but not quite enough. It's it's worthwhile checking out what the local councils that are involved actually have in terms of their meetings. And if you have a full-time job with someone else, you need to be speaking to that employer and find out what level of support they will offer. At the time, I was very fortunate that working for a well-known bank, they had a policy of encouraging political involvement. So, I got time off to go to meetings. And okay, mine were evening meetings, but I could leave work early if I had to.
Yeah. So what did you learn about yourself and your abilities and the opportunities to make political change, within that district council?
It's you turn up bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, wanting to change the world, and then you discover that there's council officers who are going to stop you. You then have to be wise, sharp, and just realistic about what you can achieve, and then try and work with people. You will find that if you're elected, that you actually get on quite well with most of the other councillors of other parties. Certainly on down in Basildon, it was the usual suspects. It was the Conservatives, it was the Labour Party, and the Liberals, or rather Lib Dems, whatever they were that week. And most of the Labour Party members were actually perfectly reasonable people. Even the one who who talked about Comrade Lenin and who dressed like him. You can actually have a good conversation with him. And when it came down to doing the business of council in the committee meetings, there was a general feeling of cooperation. Now, clearly, when you had the full council meetings, it was all bets off and yaboo, and questions to the leader, and it wasn't the question that was asked that was the problem. It was the one that was coming afterwards that was the problem. So that was just a set piece yaboo session, which was completely pointless. But that was, you went through the motions. The real work was done in the committees.
Yeah, because I know a lot of people are put off by the rough and tumble of the main council meeting, but that's very much a set piece affair, isn't it? That not an awful lot happens, and as you say, the real heavy lifting goes on in the subcommittees.
Yes. As I say, the full council meetings are frankly a waste of time. They are there for the benefit of the press, who don't bother to turn up anyway. And it's a chance for people to fancy themselves as an MP or MSP or whatever other they want to be, and kind of try and kind of catch out the opposition or the other side with sarky comments. And it's to be honest, that bit you can just ignore it, frankly. But do the work in the background. And clearly you also have a lot of correspondence from constituents who especially nowadays are complaining very loudly about things over which they feel they are being badly treated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if you split the time between meetings, the affairs with your the members of the ward who you're representing, and other activities, because I know some council members are sort of on the boards of organisations which the council invest in terms of economic development. So if you split, and also the time spent on preparing for meetings, I mean, how does the cake divide up?
I would say the lion's share is taken up by the subcommittees and the preparation for those subcommittees, and your input. I sat, for example, on the planning committee, and you'd be sitting there listening to these proposals, and you're reading up the plans and having discussions with the officers as to why this should or should not be proceeding, and challenging things. That is the bulk of the work.
Okay.
And if you're going to do it properly, it should be the bulk of the work. The set piece council meetings, frankly, that is the least important bit of what you're doing. And yeah, the engagement with the public, your surgeries, whether how often you have them. I actually don't know how often they do them here, but I know that when I was a councillor, I had a surgery once a month, and we would meet members of the public coming in, but you were getting emails on a regular basis anyway. So yeah, top of the tree, the subcommittees, the other board meetings that you're on, then the public, and then finally the set piece thing.
Yeah. And then, even though you're an experienced banker, you're telling us and the listeners that the key requirement is this ability to question everything that's put in front of you, to be fairly sort of cynical, to scrutinize, and it's not some technical expertise, whether a banker or a surveyor or an accountant or someone that leaves schools with hires and or is running their own plumbing business. It's really an attitude of mind is the key skill set.
Yeah, I would say that. Now, clearly, we bring our own experience to the game, and if you are a plumber and you're seeing things getting done, and you're thinking that doesn't make sense, clearly you challenge that. And on as a banker and a qualified accountant as well, I could go through budgets and I could spot the things that were there, but you didn't need to have that expertise, because the officers are the ones who have the expertise and should do the work.
Yeah.
Your job is to question and say, why does that make sense? Where's the evidence, and what's the and why are we doing this? And no, clearly nowadays we've all got access to Google at our fingertips, and and if someone tells you that this is what we do, and you say that you say why, and if they hesitate in the slightest, you say, well, why? Give me chapter and verse of an act of parliament that says that this is why we do it. Because a lot of things are done out of habit, or it's advised, but there's no absolute logical legal reason why you should. So yes, it's just challenge and question, and the more you do it, you will find that the council officers will actually they'll either try and screw you, and they might do that anyway, or you will find that the quality of information that you are provided with has gone up. Because despite my rather cynical sounding attitude towards council officers, there are within the council, there are quite a few people who actually care about their job and do it quite well, and are unsung heroes. They tend not to be the ones who are promoted. If you really want to find out what's going on, you go into the council offices and speak to the actual officers, and you don't, and you find the ones that perhaps have been there for a wee while.
Okay, Stuart, I want to move on to the policy setting now. And of course, a main chunk of the budget for councils is the education spend, and secondly, social care. And as you know from our sort of manifesto commitments, education is so important for our party. And to overcome some of these weaknesses in the education system, and to change the education system, and to scrutinize things like this disastrous sex education program. Now, I mean, can an individual councillor influence how education is delivered in their area?
Depends if you're on the ruling party or not. If you're at the moment, we've got the Labour and SNP operating in partnership, and you've got the situation that the Labour and SNP will not, under any circumstances, cooperate with the Conservative Party. No, they just won't do it. They would sooner hand over to someone else than do that. It's the ideological hatred is of a different scale here than it was down south, where I was. So you need to be in power. Clearly, you need to be able to speak up, and then if you're speaking up, you need to find someone that's going to listen to you. And to that extent, you need to find someone on the evening news who will listen to you. And given that the political editor of the evening news certainly used to be a card-carrying member of the Liberals, it's sometimes tricky. But it's with social media nowadays, and with WhatsApp and Telegram, you can often bypass the people who in the past would have been a useful person. So can you make an immediate difference? It's possible, but don't expect to.
Okay, and then looking at, I know in our last conversation you spoke about overlaying Scottish family policies with some of the really important local issues, and I know you've got a bee in your bonnet about what's happening in Edinburgh.
Yeah,
Do you want to explain to us what's happening in Edinburgh?
Yeah, well, in Edinburgh, for a long time, there has been, and there remains in place, a policy on Edinburgh Council that states that the council will take whatever action is necessary to discourage the use of the private car. The Socialist Republic of Edinburgh has been there for a long time. And once you understand that, everything, all the chaos that we're having with the so-called spaces for people suddenly makes sense, because it's their policy to stop us using a car. That is, there's no arguments, there's no explanation. It's just the case. Some of you may remember that in 2007, I think it was, there was a referendum in Edinburgh about the introduction of a congestion charge, and that was roundly rejected. I mean, it was kind of seriously it was thrown out the door. And when I came to Edinburgh in 2008, an Edinburgh councillor at the time told me that the day after the referendum took place, the Edinburgh Council officers, I think it was, contacted all the utilities and basically said to them, you now have carte blanche to do whatever you want, whenever you want, as often as you want. In other words, we're going to punish the people of Edinburgh for having the temerity to kind of stand against us. So if you can bear that in mind, all of a sudden, what's happened in Edinburgh, where roads have been closed without any sense, where cycle lanes, which are highly dangerous, have appeared all over the place. It's it's all makes sense because this is the mindset of the roads department and the Edinburgh Council in particular. Now, don't get me wrong, I actually ride a bicycle, and although not very often these days, I prefer a bicycle with an engine on myself. But and I don't have a problem with encouraging people to ride bicycles, but the reality is that 95% of all the bicycles on the road at the moment will go off the road on the 15th of September, because that's what happens when the weather changes. And after that, between the September and April, the ones on the road on a bicycle are either the hardcore lunatics or the really poor people who can't afford to do anything else. But okay, let's have cycle lanes, but not at the expense of the cars and lorries and buses that have to get around Edinburgh. Because what's happened, of course, is this Spaces for People thing has given them the opportunity to create congestion, which has increased pollution, which is being used as an excuse for the introduction of a low emission zone next year. But that low emission zone is going to disproportionately affect poor families, because poor families cannot, generally speaking, afford a car that's less than 3 years old. And so if you it will become illegal next year to drive a car into the centre of Edinburgh if it's not Euro 6 compliant. So that's a 2014 petrol car or 2016 diesel car, and it's what, £60 for the first time you do it, 120 for the second time, up to £900. Now, tell that to a family where the couple are on 0 hours contracts, working for a care home or a delivery driver, while they're trying to juggle and get the kids to school and nursery before they go on to their jobs. Traveling by bus or bicycle just isn't viable. But these are the people who are basically getting sidelined. So, I'm thinking Scottish Family Party have a tremendous opportunity to say, actually, you know what? We stand with the poor families of this, or even the families of this city who are of modest income. You have to be poor. You have to be just middle income to not be able to afford to just change a car. And if you're trying to get around Edinburgh, and if you're trying to get, I live in the northwest of Edinburgh. If I have to get to the Royal Infirmary, well, I've got a choice. Well, I can go onto the bypass and go around that way, or I can go round through. But the quickest way is actually through town. But that, for me, next year will become illegal. Because going up the meadows and then up to Cameron Toll and that way, I will be hit with a fine, and I'm not the only one.
Yeah. So do you sense a groundswell of frustration and a demand that these policies are halted in their tracks?
Yes, I do, and I think there is an opportunity there for the Scottish Family Party, because you are none of the above. And the fact of the matter is that the Labour Party, the SNP, and the Liberals have all voted for these policies in the past, and the Conservatives, despite the noise they're making just now, haven't really kind of done a whole lot about it. They have been complicit in a lot of the traffic management stuff that's gone on, and haven't really campaigned to say, there's roads all across Edinburgh which are closed. Why? Well, they're closed to cause congestion. That's why. You go up onto Randolph Terrace to getting into town to try and get. They've closed the access onto Heriot Row, which if they opened would allow a whole lot of traffic to go down there. Now there's no families live down there because the families can't afford those houses. But if you allowed the traffic to go down there, it would ease the congestion on York Place and Queen Street.
Yeah.
But that sort of thing is anathema to Edinburgh Council officers. So someone coming along and saying, do you know what? All these road restrictions that are there that are stopping you getting around, we will take them away. On day one, take them away. After that, we can have a conversation as to how we can, make things better.
Yeah. So there was a whole load of stuff introduced during the COVID period.
Yes.
Without any proper consultation with the residents.
Yep.
And were you saying that some residents were unable to park outside of their own homes? That suddenly they put a big there's a big roadway
yes.
with no parking.
Yes. Well, to give you a specific example, I say I live in Silverknowes. For those of you who don't know Edinburgh, it's top left-hand corner. It's in between Hilton and Barnton. So we've got Millionaires Alleyway, 300 yards one way, and the drugs capital of Europe, 300 yards the other way. But what we have, and the house we bought was partly influenced by the fact that we used to be able to get in our car, and 2 minutes later we could be at the seafront, because we would go straight down Silverknowes Road, and that would take you down to Marine Drive, which is on the Silverknowes Promenade. All of a sudden, during COVID, Silverknowes Road North, which is the bit that goes from the Muirhouse Parkway down to the seafront, was closed. And apparently it was going to be a cycleway. But those cyclists were always using it anyway. There wasn't any problem. It's not exactly a thoroughfare. It was an important route down to the seafront, and there are businesses down there. There's a caravan park, for example. All of a sudden, without consultation, without warning, it closed. And they've now turned it into a bus route and a cycle route. And you've never seen anything quite so monstrous in all your life. So that closed off one of two routes down to the seafront. The other route was a mile further along Muirhouse Parkway. And Muirhouse Parkway is a dual carriageway with 2 lanes in it. Only it's not 2 lanes anymore because they put a cycle lane on either side, which means it's down to 1.5 lanes, which means that you can't get past anything when the bus stops. But along the far end of Muirhouse Parkway is the other end of Marine Drive, which you go down that past the Salveson houses and people's houses there, and they park their cars outside their houses. They've always done that. It happens to be was the route down to a waste transfer site owned by Biffa. And so you got some fairly large articulated lorries picking up waste to be transported away from there. But of course, that became the only route down to the seafront. The traffic went up by orders of magnitude. So all of a sudden, without warning, the people who lived in the top end of Marine Drive suddenly woke up one morning to find double yellow lines outside their houses. And people who didn't have driveways were now not able to park outside their house. Better than that, they went and closed Lower Granton Road and the access to the waste transfer site, which then meant that 38-ton lorries had to go all the way down to Granton and back, adding a couple of miles to their journey in order to get to the waste transfer site. So that's just one example of what's happened, and it happened without warning, without consultation. They put in some cycle lanes on Silverknowes Road further south. They consulted on it, apparently. The local people were up in arms. The local councillors, Liberals, were up in arms. The council's officers came along and said, yes, we'll have a consultation, and then promptly ignored them and put it in after all. So, and actually a whole lot of people on Muirhouse Parkway who live there woke up one morning to find the cycle lane had been put outside their homes and double yellow lines outside their houses as well. And builders who were trying to build extensions on people's houses were getting ticketed.
Okay, so you're right in amongst this then, Stuart, and you're tapping into this frustration and this lack of local democracy, and this is firing you up to do something about it. But if I could compare that point to the one you made earlier, that say on family education issues, you said a Scottish Family Party councillor probably couldn't do an awful lot. But do you think if we got one or two elected in Edinburgh, that would change things on the on this traffic chaos? Would something happen?
One or two, no. There are 42 councillors on Edinburgh Council. I think it is. And you need to have common cause with enough people to have a majority. Now, this is where the Scottish Family Party, I think, has an opportunity, because being none of the above, you can take votes from the SNP, you can take votes from the Labour Party, and from the Liberals, and so you can campaign on that basis. You can probably take a lot of votes from the Conservatives as well. Although, if the Conservatives were to be true to their word, they might actually be willing to do something. But that's it. I think you almost need to a plague on all your houses, and you've got to have a candidate in every single ward. Because of the voting system with multi-member wards, you could put up two, but that could result in a less good result than if you put up one.
Yeah. Okay, Stuart, I'm going to have to start wrapping this up, and but thank you very much for your insights on being a councillor. What motivated you, how to succeed in the role, and then for highlighting what's happening in Edinburgh. And it looks like we're going to need about 21 candidates to rally together to cover Edinburgh. So I do hope this interview would be part of the clarion call, because I do like the fits between the Scottish Family Party and these issues. Poorer families, larger families who need to do the school run, go on dental trips to the dentist, to the hospital, families with someone with a disability, night workers, shift workers, ordinary people whose lives are being made miserable by individuals that are making these decisions, and often these officers are not members of families. I mean, you said most of them are sort of in their 30s, not married, and are part of the environmental sort of Taliban. But that brings us up to 10 o'clock, and I look forward to being in touch with you again, Stuart. So thank you very much indeed for your contribution.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Good night to you.
Bye.
Good night.